The year was 1903, and the air in the small, dusty town bordering the vast, enigmatic landscape of Mammoth Cave, Kentucky, carried a peculiar mix of anticipation and trepidation. The cave system itself, a labyrinth of subterranean passages carved by eons of slow-moving water, was a source of both pride and profound, almost primal fear. Its known reaches stretched for miles, but the unknown, the rumored unexplored depths, held a siren call for those with a certain disposition, the ambitious, the restless, and the desperately curious. Our protagonist, Elias Vance, was one of these. A civil engineer by trade, with a keen, almost obsessive eye for detail and structure, Elias wasn't driven by profit, but by recognition. He craved the definitive map, the final word on the cave's true size, a feat that would etch his name into the annals of geological history. At 35, he was the lead organizer of the most extensive, well-funded, and perhaps hubristic expedition ever attempted into the cave's heart. The team was a motley collection of 17 souls, each chosen for a specific skill, but bound by a common, reckless confidence. There was Dr. Alistair Finch, the aged, esteemed geologist from the University of Louisville, whose knowledge of the cave's known passages was unparalleled, but whose recent frailty worried Elias. Marty Hayes, a tough, pragmatic journalist, was there to document the triumph, her notebook and quick wit often unsettling the more traditional members. And then there was Silas the Rock Thorn, the chief guide, a man born and raised near the caves, whose silence was as deep as the tunnels themselves, and who now stood, eyes narrowed at the cavern's mouth, watching the city fog mingle with the humid Kentucky air. The morning of the departure was overcast, the oppressive humidity a heavy blanket over the small encampment. The rumble of the small engine powering the few electric lamps they were bringing sounded jarringly modern against the backdrop of untouched wilderness. Elias, despite his meticulous planning, every rope inspected, every tin of biscuits accounted for, every oil lamp wick trimmed, felt a cold prickle of unease. It wasn't the cave that troubled him, it was the sheer size of his team and the monumental ambition of their goal. To find and chart the legendary Deep Shaft, a rumored passage that supposedly dropped hundreds of feet, connecting the system to an entirely new, undiscovered tier. "Ready, Mr. Vance." Silas's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, cutting through the final checks. Elias snapped his pocket watch shut. "As ready as we'll ever be, Silas. We keep a tight formation. Finch, you stay just behind me. Marty, you'll be with the cartographers. No one deviates from the main line without explicit instruction." The first few hours were almost celebratory. The grand, familiar passages, cool and quiet, swallowed the sound of their heavy boots. The electric lamps cast long, dancing shadows, momentarily pushing back the immensity of the darkness. Dr. Finch, despite his age, lectured animatedly about the limestone formations, his voice echoing with a scholarly enthusiasm. Marty, ever the keen observer, noted the atmosphere, the scent of damp earth and bat guano, the absolute suffocating quiet when they paused. The turn came 4 hours in. They left the well-trodden tourist route and headed down the narrow, slippery passage known only as the Serpent's Coil. The air grew noticeably cooler, the path tighter. The celebratory chatter died down, replaced by the rhythmic scrape of their gear and the heavy sound of breathing. It was here, 7 hours into the descent, near the juncture known as the Whispering Gallery, that the first serious disagreement erupted. "Elias, stop. I don't like this," Dr. Finch said, his voice strained, clutching his chest. "The geological structure here is unstable. We're directly beneath the largest fault line. If we push further, a sudden change in pressure—" "Nonsense, Doctor." Elias cut him off, his tone sharp, edged with the exhaustion of the climb and the impatience of an ambitious man. "The geological survey cleared this route. We are nearly at the coordinates for the deep shaft. We are not turning back now, not with all we've invested." Marty stepped forward, her face smudged with dust but her eyes clear. "Elias, he's the expert. Silas, what do you say?" Silas Thorne merely shook his head, his gaze sweeping over the low, cracked ceiling. "The rock talks to the guide, Miss Hayes. It's quiet now. Too quiet. But Vance is the one signing the checks." The implicit tension, a thread of doubt woven into the expedition's fabric, tightened into a knot. Elias, fueled by ego and the fear of failure, made his command absolute. They pressed on. This was the precise moment, the dismissal of expert caution for the sake of ambition, that history would later identify as their initial fatal misstep. They proceeded, the team fractured by the decision, deeper into the Earth's silent maw. The passage soon opened into a massive, echoing chamber. At its center was not the deep shaft, but a colossal, ancient pile of debris, a complete blockage, the result of a catastrophic, long-ago ceiling collapse. Their path was sealed. A collective groan of disappointment swept through the group, quickly replaced by a desperate, palpable fear when the lamps began to flicker. The sound wasn't of dripping water, but of falling rock, a sound that started as a whisper and rapidly crescendoed into a deafening roar from the passage they had just traversed. The air pressure suddenly shifted, a forceful vacuum pulling at their clothes. Elias stared back the way they came, his face pale, the map slipping from his numb fingers. The route was collapsing. The darkness was no longer just the absence of light. It was a physical, crushing presence. Marty's voice, though shaking, rose above the chaos. "Everyone! The main passage is closed. We need to find the secondary route now, Elias. Where's the auxiliary map?" The silence of the cave was broken by the sickening sound of more rock grinding on rock, the passage shaking violently. They were trapped, 17 souls miles beneath the earth, and the true terror had just begun. Thank you for reading the first chapter. The tension is high, and the stakes are set. If you're invested in Elias's desperate struggle and want to see if they can find a way out, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapters in this terrifying real-life disaster. Now, let's continue the story. The dust, thick and suffocating, swirled under the sickly yellow glow of the remaining electric lamps. The initial roar of the collapse had subsided, leaving behind a chilling, irregular pattern of sharp cracks and minor rumbling. The earth settling, a geological sigh that promised further disaster. The air was heavy with pulverized stone and the scent of fear. Elias, galvanized by Marty's urgent demand, wrestled control from the panic clawing at his throat. He dropped to his knees, frantically unrolling the auxiliary map, a hastily drawn schematic of secondary fissures and tight squeezes, known only through local folklore and Silas's secretive knowledge. "We have two options," Elias gasped, pointing a trembling finger at the parchment. The Needle's Eye, a crawl space 6 inches wide, 20 feet long, but it bypasses the main collapse. Or the Blind Drop, a vertical descent down an unknown shaft. Risky, but it might lead to a lower, more stable level. Dr. Finch, leaning against a cold, slick wall, looked skeletal and utterly defeated. "The Blind Drop is folly, Elias. The Needle's Eye is our only hope, however claustrophobic. It requires moving one at a time, leaving all but essential gear." The team, 17 strong, was now a single, terrified organism. The cartographers, the supply men, the assistants, their titles were meaningless now. Survival was the only expertise that mattered. Two of the younger men, brothers named Thomas and Henry, were already arguing in hushed, panicked tones about who should go first. Silas stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the flickering light. His face was a mask of cold professionalism. "The Needle's Eye it is. I go first. I secure the line. Then the doctor, then Miss Hayes, then Mr. Vance. We move swiftly. Anyone who freezes, anyone who panics, delays us all." His eyes, usually distant, were sharp, commanding obedience. The Needle's Eye was aptly named. It was a jagged tear in the limestone floor, barely wide enough for a slender man to squeeze through on his belly, elbows scraping against the rough rock. The first men who went through emerged on the other side, dusted and bruised, breathing shallowly, their faces etched with the strain of fighting the urge to panic in the tight space. The progression was agonizingly slow. The sound of the cave shifting behind them, a low, grinding noise, was a constant, terrifying clock. When it was Dr. Finch's turn, his weakness became cruelly apparent. Midway through the crawl, his chest seized. I can't breathe." His voice was a choked whisper, magnified by the stone tunnel. He was stuck, his body wedged, blocking the passage for everyone behind him. Panic flared. A supply assistant, a man named George who had been quiet until now, screamed, a high, desperate sound that echoed horrifyingly. "He's going to seal us in. Pull him out. Get him out of the way." Elias and Marty exchanged a look of sheer desperation. If George panicked, the entire mission to pass through the crawl space would fail. Elias reached forward, his voice low and firm, overriding the hysteria. "George, stop! Marty, calm him! Silas, what is his position?" Silas, already through on the other side, grabbed Finch's ankles and pulled with a grunt of exertion. But the doctor's shoulders were wedged. "It's no good. He's stuck on the left protrusion," Silas yelled. Marty moved to George, gripping his shoulders with surprising strength. "Look at me, George. We will not panic. Dr. Finch is a brave man, but he is weak. We need to work together. Elias, can you push him to the right?" Elias, ignoring the dust and the constriction, moved his shoulder against Finch's back, trying to shift the rigid, frail body. The stone around them trembled violently, a new, louder crack tearing through the ceiling of their current chamber. The time for deliberation was over. "Push Elias hard!" Silas yelled. With a final desperate heave, Elias pushed, and Silas pulled. There was a sickening scraping sound, and Dr. Finch shot forward into the adjoining passage, collapsing unconscious. He was free, but the effort had been too much. The passage held. The moment Finch was cleared, Elias shoved George into the crawl space, roaring, "Go, move, don't look back!" The force of Elias's authority, born of terror, momentarily silenced the panic. One by one, they continued the agonizing crawl. When Elias finally dragged himself through the needle's eye, his clothing was shredded, his skin scraped raw, but he was through. He looked back. The entrance to the crawl space was beginning to fissure, tiny pieces of rock flaking off the edges. 13 men were accounted for, including Dr. Finch, whom Marty was tending to. 4 men were still on the wrong side, the cartographers and 2 supply men. "Where are they? Why aren't they moving?" Elias demanded, his voice hoarse. A faint, strained cry echoed back from the darkness beyond the crawl space. "The hole. It's getting smaller. We can't fit. It's crushing us." The earth was actively constricting the passage. The initial shock had caused the structural integrity to fail. Elias scrambled back to the opening, his heart hammering against his ribs. The gap was noticeably tighter, the jagged edges pressed inwards. "Flatten yourselves. You must try again," Elias yelled, his words barely audible over the increasing rumble. A moment later they heard a muffled, terrifying shriek, followed by the dull thud of heavy rock falling. Then, silence. Absolute crushing silence. Elias slumped back, his mind refusing to process the certainty of what had just happened. They were 12 now. The weight of that loss, the failure of his leadership, was a tangible, icy pressure. Silas, ignoring the grief, was already moving, checking Dr. Finch. "He's alive, but barely. Broken ribs, I think. We can't carry him easily. The passage ahead, Mr. Vance, is steep and unstable. We have to move, or the cave will finish the job." They were deeper, safer from the immediate collapse, but the path ahead was a descent into an unknown, treacherous blackness. The air itself seemed thinner, heavier, laden with unspoken accusation. The terror had killed 4 of them. The suspense now was how long the cave would take to claim the rest. The new passage was a stark, menacing contrast to the vast, familiar halls they had left behind. It was a steep, winding slope of loose shale and slick, clay-coated rock, forcing them to proceed in a slow, staggered descent. The air grew perceptibly colder, the silence more profound, broken only by the nervous sounds of their shifting weight and the occasional unsettling ping of water dripping from an unseen height. The mood was one of numb, shell-shocked efficiency. The loss of the 4 men, not to an accident, but to the deliberate crushing force of the earth, had instilled a raw, immediate fear that transcended panic, settling into a cold dread. They were operating on instinct, their eyes constantly scanning the ceiling, their trust in Elias's leadership dissolving like salt in water. Elias, despite his outward command, felt the weight of 12 pairs of eyes on his back. He had to prove he was still the man with the plan, the one who could lead them out. But his confidence had been shattered with the thud of the falling rock. "We follow the downward slope," Elias instructed, his voice barely steady. "Silas, take the lead. Secure the lines. Marty, keep an eye on Dr. Finch. We can't leave him, but he's slowing us down dangerously." Marty nodded grimly, using a discarded piece of rope to sling Dr. Finch's frail, barely conscious body onto the back of a stronger member of the team, a sturdy man named Daniel. The descent continued for what felt like hours. Elias consulted the secondary map, tracing the faint dotted line that represented the conjectured continuation of the passage. The map was vague, relying on outdated local legends. "Silas," Elias called out from the middle of the line. "Does this match your knowledge? Are we on the path to the Grotto of the Forgotten River?" Silas paused, his lamp beam sweeping over a stretch of wall covered in calcified flowstone that looked disturbingly like frozen pale viscera. He rubbed a hand over the cold rock. "Maybe. The river grotto is a rumor, Mr. Vance, a local tale used to scare children. It's said to be miles wide, with a river deep enough to swallow a whole house. But the passage leading to it was never confirmed. We need confirmation, Silas. Our main lights are starting to dim. We only have a few hours of electric light left, and then it's back to oil and candle flame." Elias snapped, the pressure eroding his composure. Silas simply stared at the engineer, a look of profound, almost pitying disapproval on his face. "Confirmation is something we left up on the surface, Mr. Vance. Down here we have only geology and instinct, and your geology failed us." The brutal honesty cut Elias deeply. Marty intervened before the confrontation could escalate. "Both of you stop. Arguing won't change the structural integrity of the ceiling," she said, her tone level and authoritative. "Silas, if the river grotto is our goal, what's the local lore about the water? Is it safe?" Silas's grim expression softened slightly at Marty's pragmatism. "It's clean, they say, if it exists. But the legends also speak of currents that drag things under, things that never surface." They pressed on, their journey becoming an internal struggle as much as an external one. The rations were becoming a source of contention. With the loss of 4 men, they had surplus, but the uncertainty of their timeline led to whispers of rationing amongst the supply crew. The psychological toll began to manifest in small, terrifying ways. In the absolute quiet of a short rest stop, one of the assistants, a quiet, nervous man named Robert, suddenly screamed and scrambled backward, his eyes wide and fixed on the darkness. "What is it, Robert? What do you see?" Marty rushed to him, shining her small hand lamp into the black void. "Movement, over there. A shadow, a flash of white, like a hand reaching out." Robert was hyperventilating, pointing toward a shallow alcove. Elias, impatient with what he assumed was hysteria, shoved past Marty. "It's nothing, Robert. A trick of the light. We are all tired." Silas, however, moved slower, his lamp steady. He reached into the alcove and pulled out a small, wet bat skeleton. "It's a shadow trick, Robert." The lamp moved. The bone reflected the light. "We are tired. Fear plays tricks on the eye." But the terror in Robert's eyes didn't subside. He was not convinced. The seed of psychological distrust was planted. The darkness was now not just empty space, but a canvas for their own mounting anxieties. Were they truly alone? Or was someone or something else moving in the tunnels they couldn't see? The mystery deepened an hour later. They had just navigated a tricky, narrow bend when Silas suddenly stopped, holding his hand up. "Silence. Listen." The group froze. The only sound was their ragged breathing and the faint drip, drip, drip of water. Then, faintly, undeniably, they heard it. A rhythmic sound, like a stone scraping against another stone, coming from ahead, down the passage. It sounded too regular to be a natural collapse. Elias frowned, his engineer's mind searching for a logical explanation. "Is that water runoff, Silas? The current?" Silas shook his head, his lamp beam moving quickly. "No current here. The scraping is too deliberate. It's moving. It's coming closer." 17 men had entered. 4 were crushed. They were 12. But the sound ahead suggested a presence. If it wasn't the collapse and it wasn't natural, who or what was down there waiting in the darkness? The hope of finding help vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp dread. The scraping sound intensified, no longer faint but a clear metallic ch-ch that resonated unnervingly off the cavern walls. It was the sound of something being dragged, or perhaps something deliberately being used to make noise. The 12 remaining explorers huddled together, their lamps casting a small, terrified circle of light against the oppressive black. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline, sharpening his focus. "Silas, Marty, we need to scout ahead. 2 of you stay back and guard Doctor. Finch and the supplies, do not engage. If you hear trouble, retreat immediately." Silas, ever the professional, nodded and drew a heavy, short-handled hammer, a tool usually reserved for breaking small geological samples, from his belt. Marty, too, produced a small, solid iron ruler she used for mapping, its weight comforting in her hand. Elias, gripping a heavy-duty electric lamp, led the way. They moved forward with painful caution, hugging the damp, cold wall. The air here was strangely still, devoid of the natural drafts that usually swept through the cave. The scraping sound was now just around a sharp, downward bend. Elias raised his hand to signal a stop. He extinguished his electric lamp, plunging them into absolute sensory-depriving darkness, the true darkness of the deep earth. The sound of the scraping became even clearer in the void, followed by a faint, irregular rhythmic tapping. It was the sound of labor. "Wait here," Silas whispered, his voice a breath. He was a creature of the cave, and the darkness was his element. He moved silently, a shadow dissolving into the black, while Elias and Marty pressed themselves against the wall, hearts pounding. The suspense was unbearable. Each ch-ch was a hammer blow against their sanity. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, Silas reappeared, his face pale even in the faint returning light of Elias's lamp. "It's not a person, not a rescue team," Silas reported, his voice low and tight. "It's a trap, or what's left of one." He led Elias and Marty around the bend. There, illuminated by Silas's lamp, was the horrifying reality. A hastily constructed barricade of heavy, smooth riverstones and sharp shale, almost completely blocking the passage. It was clearly not a natural formation. The scraping sound was an old, rusted pickaxe lying on the ground, being dragged by the remnants of a rope. The rhythmic tapping was the small, sporadic movement of a heavier stone, dislodged by the rope's friction. The trap was sprung, but the noise lingered. "Someone did this," Marty breathed, her eyes wide with shock. "Someone intentionally sealed this passage to prevent entry or exit." Elias's mind raced. The cave system is vast. Others might be charting it, but no one would do this. This is sabotage. We dismissed Dr. Finch's fears as paranoia, but he was concerned about the route being unstable, yes. But he also spoke of rival exploration teams in the area, geologists who might want to keep the deep shaft secret. A chilling thought struck Marty. If a rival team did this, they would have to have been inside the cave when they collapsed the main route. Or they knew our route and set this barricade here, expecting us to use the auxiliary passage. Either way, they knew we were coming. The reality of a malicious human element was more terrifying than the natural disaster. They were not just fighting the cave. They were fighting a calculated, unseen enemy. Silas, kneeling by the barricade, pointed to a small, dark object wedged between 2 rocks. He extracted it carefully. It was a partially burned matchstick, struck recently, and an impression in the mud where a boot, not their own, had rested. They were here, Silas confirmed, his voice laced with venom. They did this. They knew we were coming, or they were trying to seal their own passage and didn't care who they trapped. Look at the stones. They're sealed with a mud and gypsum mixture. It would take hours to dig through this, even with proper tools. The gravity of their situation intensified. Not only were they trapped, but someone had actively engineered their demise. Back with the rest of the group, Elias tried to maintain control, but the discovery of the barricade plunged the remaining 10 men and Marty into a state of acute paranoia. "Who are they, Elias? Why do they want us dead?" Daniel, the strong assistant, demanded, his voice shaking. Elias struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't incite a full-blown mutiny. "They are rivals, Daniel. They want to claim the discovery for themselves. They wanted to turn us back, not kill us." The timing of the collapse was unfortunate for them too. But this explanation was weak, and it failed to convince. If the collapse was an accident, why the barricade? If the barricade was intentional, the rival team had essentially left them to die. Dr. Finch surprisingly stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked directly at Elias, his gaze clear and sharp despite his pain. "It wasn't a rival team, Elias," Dr. Finch whispered, his voice raspy but firm. "It was him. He's always been jealous. He told me he'd bury me in this hole if I tried to claim the deep shaft first." "Who, Doctor? Who is him?" Marty pressed, leaning close. Finch tried to speak again, but a spasm of pain seized him, and he sank back into semi-consciousness, only managing to choke out a single cryptic name. Hollister. Hollister. The name meant nothing to the rest of the crew, but Elias and Marty instantly recognized it. Dr. Arthur Hollister, Finch's former research partner. A brilliant but notoriously erratic geologist who had vanished from the academic world 5 years prior after a scandal involving stolen research. He was obsessed with the cave's depths. The mystery was now personal, and the stakes raised to a terrifying degree. They were being hunted, or at least deliberately impeded, by a vengeful, psychologically unbalanced man who knew the cave system as well as Finch. The suspense tightened. They had to find a way past the barricade, knowing that the man who built it might still be close by, watching from the dark. The name Hollister hung in the cold, damp air like a spectral presence, instantly giving form and malice to the amorphous terror. They were no longer victims of a random geological event, but participants in a deadly personal vendetta. The psychological pressure was immense. They were trapped, hunted, and their only map was compromised by an unknown saboteur. Elias quickly organized the remaining crew. The barricade was solid but not insurmountable. Using the few remaining tools, shovels, small picks, and geological hammers, they began the grueling, agonizing process of dismantling the wall of stones. Silas, the strong, silent foundation of the team, proved invaluable, working with a relentless, controlled fury. Marty, abandoning her notebook for the shovel, kept a steady rhythm, her pragmatic presence a counterbalance to the growing paranoia among the other men. Elias, meanwhile, took a moment to inspect their primary navigational tools, a set of expensive, specialized compasses and barometers essential for charting. What he discovered was a cold, calculated act of sabotage far more insidious than the barricade. "The compasses are compromised," Elias announced, his voice tight with controlled rage. He held up a delicate instrument. The magnetic needle was subtly bent, enough to throw off a precise reading by several degrees, a fatal error in a three-dimensional labyrinth. And the oil in the barometer housing has been diluted, making the pressure readings inaccurate. The saboteur hadn't just sealed them in. He had ensured that even if they escaped, they would wander lost in the deepest, most complex sections of the cave. Hollister wasn't just vengeful, he was meticulous and psychologically cruel. "We have to rely on Silas," Marty stated, wiping sweat and mud from her brow. "He's the only uncompromised compass we have. Silas, can you navigate us based on instinct and memory alone? No readings, just feel?" Silas looked up from wrestling a massive stone. His lamplight caught the determination in his eyes. "I can try, Miss Hayes, but the depth we're at, the magnetic pull is erratic anyway." And these tunnels are new to me. The map was the only thing connecting them to the surface. Without a good map, it's a game of chance. One wrong turn leads to a dead end, and every dead end leads to panic. As they chipped away at the barricade, the group began to fracture. Two of the younger men, Thomas and Henry, who had barely survived the needle's eye, began hoarding biscuits and water. They were driven by a chilling self-preservation instinct. "We're rationing, boys," Elias commanded, trying to sound authoritative. "No one eats or drinks more than their share. We're a team." "No, you are," Thomas sneered, clutching his satchel tighter. "You're the one who got us into this. You ignored the doctor. You ignored Silas. You'll get us out or we'll save ourselves." The threat was clear. The breakdown of command was almost complete. Elias understood that the real danger wasn't the cave or Hollister, but the inevitable descent into primal selfishness. Hours passed, marked only by the aches in their muscles and the diminishing glow of the electric lamps. Finally, the barricade was breached. A hole just wide enough for them to squeeze through opened up, revealing a passage that sloped steeply downward, wet and slippery, leading into an abyss of blackness. Before they moved, Marty shone her lamp back into the chamber where they had been working. She noticed something glinting near where Dr. Finch lay, barely breathing. It was a small, ornate silver locket, definitely not belonging to anyone in their crew. It was a classic calling card left by the saboteur. She picked it up. Engraved on the back was a single initial, H. The locket was a message, a confirmation that Hollister was playing a twisted game of psychological terror. He was toying with them, letting them know he was near, enjoying their desperation. As Marty showed the locket to Elias, Dr. Finch suddenly went into a violent, rattling cough. Daniel, who had been carrying him, dropped the frail man carelessly. "I can't carry him anymore. He's dead weight. We're wasting time," Daniel shouted, abandoning Finch in his desperation to get through the newly cleared passage. "We don't leave him," Elias roared, rushing to Finch's side. But the majority of the team was already moving, driven by the fear of being sealed in again. They scrambled through the hole, a chaotic, panicked rush for the unknown path. Elias and Marty watched in horror as the group disintegrated, leaving them, Silas, and the barely conscious Dr. Finch alone. Silas grabbed a rope, securing one end around Finch's waist and the other around his own shoulder. "We don't leave anyone behind, Mr. Vance. That's the rule of the Rock." As they prepared to descend into the treacherous new passage, Elias looked back one last time at the chamber. The atmosphere was different now. The smell of dust and damp rock was replaced by a faint, unfamiliar, almost sweet metallic odor. A smell that shouldn't exist miles beneath the surface. It was a faint, unsettling mystery that added to their dread. The final act of their descent was a choice. Follow the panicked, selfish group and hope they led the way, or trust Silas's instinct and try to forge a new path. Elias looked at the locket, then at the unconscious Finch, and finally at Silas, whose face was a study in grim resolve. The terror of the unknown was pulling them deeper, away from the surface, away from hope. Elias, Marty, and Silas chose to follow the main group. The passage was too precarious to attempt an alternative route while dragging the heavy weight of Dr. Finch. The slope was unrelenting, the ground constantly threatening to give way beneath their feet, covered in a treacherous layer of wet clay. The psychological distance between the three loyalists and the splintered group ahead was greater than the physical. The sound of the main group, their hurried boots, their desperate whispers, their lack of coordination, echoed back, a warning of their accelerating panic. "They're moving too fast," Silas observed grimly, securing the ropes around a protruding piece of bedrock. "They're not paying attention to the stability of the floor. This area is old, eroded limestone. One wrong step, and they'll drop into a fissure." Marty, using her keen journalistic observation, noticed something the others missed. "Look at the walls, Elias. There are scratch marks here, lower down. They look fresh. Hollister passed this way too recently. He's ahead of us, or he's circling back." The implication was terrifying. Hollister was using the geography of the cave itself as his weapon, deliberately driving them into the most unstable sections. After another hour of grueling descent, the passage widened into a large flat cavern. The air here was strangely dry and dusty. The main group, exhausted and arguing, had stopped in the center. "Vance, we're trapped again!" Daniel shouted, his face contorted with desperation and fury. "The tunnel ends here. It's a complete wall. You brought us to a dead end." Elias and Silas hurried to the front. Indeed, the cavern, vast and echoing, terminated abruptly in a sheer, unyielding wall of solid rock. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. The desperation of the men was now palpable, turning into outright hostility directed at Elias. "You said you had a map. You said you knew the route." Henry, one of the hoarding brothers, screamed, lunging at Elias. Silas stepped in front of Elias, his hammer raised. "Stand down, Henry. We are not fighting each other. That's what he wants." Marty, however, ignored the confrontation, her lamp beam sweeping across the smooth, dry floor. Her journalist's instinct for detail took over. "Wait a minute. Look down. This floor is too flat, too smooth for a natural cavern floor. It looks almost engineered." Elias knelt down, brushing away the dust. Marty was right. The surface was a slab of a different kind of rock, a dense, dark limestone, clearly laid over the natural cave floor. It wasn't a dead end. It was a trap door. Silas examined the edges, feeling the stone with his calloused hands. A seal. Someone laid this slab here to conceal a lower passage. It's held in place by friction and sheer weight. And look. He pointed to a small, almost invisible indentation near the wall. Hollister left his mark. A pry point. The realization that this dead end was another of Hollister's calculated manipulations, a psychological test designed to break their will before they even noticed the exit, galvanized the group, momentarily displacing their panic with a sense of focus. They had been given a chance. The slab was massive, requiring the coordinated effort of all 9 able-bodied men to move. They leveraged their shovels and picks, straining against the heavy rock, their grunts echoing in the large chamber. As the slab slowly scraped against the floor, revealing a dark, square opening beneath it, Dr. Finch, whom they had momentarily forgotten, let out a low, terrified whimper. "Don't go down there. The sweetness. It's down there," he murmured, his eyes rolling back in his head. His mention of the sweetness brought back the memory of the metallic, unusual odor Elias had detected earlier. It was stronger now, rising up from the pit beneath the slab, a sickly, sweet smell that immediately raised the hairs on the back of Elias's neck. It was the scent of something artificial, something chemical, not natural earth. "What is that smell, Silas?" Marty demanded, coughing into her kerchief. Silas inhaled deeply, his face paling even further. "I don't know, Miss Hayes, but I don't like it. It's not the cave." Elias, despite the odor, lowered his lamp into the hole. The light revealed a steep, well-cut shaft leading down, unlike the rough passages they had been traversing. At the bottom, a sheer drop of at least 50 feet, with a narrow ledge visible below. But before they could secure a rope, the unthinkable happened. Daniel, who had been pulling a pickaxe out from beneath the slab, slipped. His boot scraped against a loose edge of the slab. The massive stone, thrown slightly off balance, began to slide, faster and faster, before crashing back down over the opening with a deafening, sickening crunch. Daniel screamed, a raw, primal sound that was suddenly cut short. When the dust settled, the slab had slid back, but not completely. A small gap remained. They peered into it. Daniel's legs were visible, pinned at the knees beneath the stone. He was still alive, his body writhing silently in agony, his eyes wide and unseeing, staring into the crushing blackness. The air was now thick with the sickly sweet odor and the copper scent of fresh blood. The trap had sprung again. Hollister hadn't intended for the door to be permanent. He had intended for it to be deadly. They were 8, plus the barely conscious doctor, and they were staring down at the very real, very human cost of their ambition. The scream was now a muffled, choked sound emanating from beneath the slab, a sound that tore at the last remnants of the crew's sanity. Daniel was not only trapped, but slowly being crushed, and the metallic, sweet odor, now undeniably strong, seemed to cling to the air around the trapdoor, mingling with the scent of his blood. Elias, Marty, and Silas immediately tried to heave the slab again, their desperation lending them a momentary, futile surge of strength. They strained and cried out, but the stone had settled back down, burying the leverage points they had previously used. "We can't move it. It's too heavy," Elias gasped, collapsing to his knees, his hands raw and bleeding. Henry and Thomas, the two brothers, watched from a short distance, their faces a mixture of horror and cold calculation. They had completely detached themselves emotionally. Marty crawled to the small opening, her face inches from the crushed man. Daniel's eyes, though conscious, were glazed over with shock. "Daniel, can you hear me? We're going to get you out. Just hold on." Daniel only managed a gurgling sound, his chest heaving shallowly. It was clear he was dying. Silas, however, was not looking at Daniel. He was inspecting the faint, sweet-smelling dust that had puffed up from the hole. He dipped his finger into the residue and brought it to his nose, sniffing cautiously. "It's not gunpowder," Silas stated, his voice low and serious. "It's a form of chemical accelerant, something explosive but designed to slowly eat away at the stone's integrity, not a sudden blast. Hollister was planning to use this to clear the path for himself, or to ensure that any major vibration, like a shifting slab, would trigger a more massive collapse. The trapdoor was an active hazard. Hollister hadn't just relied on weight, he had primed the area for disaster. The immediate crisis, however, was Daniel. The man was suffering, and the effort to save him was futile, and would exhaust their remaining energy and risk another collapse. Elias looked at Marty, and the shared, terrible understanding of the situation passed between them. They couldn't save Daniel. They could only try to end his suffering and secure the passage. "Silas," Elias said, his voice a low, hard rasp. "The heavy pick. Make it quick, and then we seal that gap with the smaller stones. The air quality in that hole is bad." The decision was the hardest and most morally degrading act Elias had ever had to perform. It was a conscious sacrifice of one life for the potential survival of the 7 others. Silas, without a word, nodded, his face etched with pain, and performed the grim task swiftly and humanely, drawing on the cold, brutal practicality of a man of the wilderness. The sound, though muffled, was a final, chilling punctuation mark on their descent into horror. Henry and Thomas, who had witnessed the chilling necessity of the act, recoiled. Their paranoia was now focused on Elias and Silas. If they could sacrifice one of their own, what would they do to save themselves? Marty, sickened but resolute, helped Silas use smaller rocks to plug the opening beneath the slab, slowing the chemical vapor from rising. "We cannot go down that hole," Marty declared, turning to Elias. "Hollister is using that path, and he's rigged it. It's a death trap. Silas, is there another way? Any fissure, any hole, any draft that suggests an alternative route?" Silas pointed his lamp toward a narrow, almost invisible fissure in the side wall, hidden behind a large stalagmite. "There is. It's barely big enough for a man, and I can feel a draft. It's a risk, but it will take us away from Hollister's preferred path and the sweet-smelling poison." Elias looked at the 5 remaining men, their faces a mix of exhaustion, terror, and mute accusation. He knew the command structure was broken beyond repair. "New plan. We follow Silas, one at a time. Leave the non-essential gear," Elias commanded, his voice firm. "No room for dissent." Henry and Thomas immediately balked. "No, that fissure is too tight. We're going back," Henry yelled, pointing a trembling finger up the treacherous, slippery passage they had just descended. "We can climb out. We're not following you into another hole. The main route is sealed, Henry, and the collapse might have continued behind us. You'll die of exhaustion and fear climbing back up that shale slope," Marty argued passionately, but fear had made them deaf to reason. The brothers, along with another assistant named Paul, turned and began the agonizing climb back up the slope, driven by a deluded hope of escaping the way they came. Elias, Marty, and Silas watched them go, knowing the ascent was almost certainly a death sentence. They were now only 3, plus Dr. Finch, who was barely clinging to life. They were stripped of their large team, their maps, and their trust, but they had gained a grim, realistic resolve. The way ahead was dark, tight, and unknown, but it was away from Hollister's traps. They secured Dr. Finch with a final rope and began to drag him through the narrow, rough fissure, moving toward the draft, toward the promise of a different way out. As Elias squeezed into the opening, he looked back at the vast, silent cavern, realizing the terrible symmetry of their loss. The collapse had taken 4, and their own fear and desperation had now claimed 6 more. The suspense deepens as the group shrinks, and the human element of terror becomes clear. If you've followed this story of survival and psychological horror so far, you're in for a shocking finish. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to catch the final 3 chapters. They are the most crucial. Now let's continue with the descent. The fissure was a salvation and a torment. It was so tight in places that Elias had to exhale fully to squeeze his chest through, the rough limestone tearing at his clothes and skin. But the air current, the draft, was real, a subtle, cold whisper against his face, proving the passage led somewhere open, somewhere that communicated with a larger, perhaps even external system. The effort of dragging Dr. Finch was immense. Silas, with his powerful build, took the lead, using a series of specialized knots to distribute the weight. Marty acted as the anchor and morale compass, her determined silence a source of strength for Elias, who was struggling not only with the physical exertion, but with the crushing guilt of the past few hours. "Elias," Marty whispered, her voice strained by the effort. "You made the right choice back there. Daniel was gone. The others, they chose their path. Focus on the draft. Focus on the end." Her support was the first genuine comfort Elias had felt since the collapse. His ambition had led them into the cave, but the support of Silas and Marty was what was now leading him out. After nearly 2 hours of agonizing progress, the fissure abruptly opened into a smooth-walled cylindrical shaft. The draft here was a steady, strong wind, blowing distinctly upward. "An air chimney," Elias breathed, his engineer's mind lighting up with a flicker of hope. "It's a natural vent. It should lead straight to the surface, or at least to a much higher, safer level." However, the shaft was too tall to climb without professional caving equipment, which they had left behind at the barricade. They had ropes, but no mechanical ascenders, and the smooth walls offered no purchase. Just as their hope threatened to curdle into despair, Silas pointed his lamp to the side of the shaft. There, almost completely obscured by mineral deposits, was a set of crude, thick wooden ladders secured by rusted bolts into the rock wall. They were old, dangerously decayed, but they were there. "Hollister," Elias murmured, recognizing the style. "He must have used this. But why leave the ladder? He wanted us to die, not follow him." Marty inspected the wood. "He didn't leave it for us, Elias. He must have used this as a temporary route, maybe to check on his barricade, and assumed the general collapse would destroy it. The wood is rotten. It's a massive risk." The choice was clear: the deadly shaft or the impossible climb back to the surface. Silas took a piece of rope, tying it securely around his waist, and began the ascent, testing each rung with excruciating care. The ladder creaked and groaned under his weight, the sound echoing ominously up the shaft. Elias secured Dr. Finch to his back, using a sturdy harness system he had designed for mapping. Finch's breathing was shallow and erratic, but he was holding on. Marty went next, her agility and light weight helping her move quickly. She was nearing the top when a heavy crack echoed from above. The top rung, secured by the weakest bolt, snapped beneath her hand. Marty cried out, scrabbling for a handhold. She swung dangerously out over the pit, her weight now fully dependent on the one hand gripping a lower, slick rung. Silas, who had already reached the top and secured the rope, didn't hesitate. He yelled, "Grab the line, Marty, hold fast," and began to feed the line down to her, ignoring the risk of the old rope fraying on the jagged rock edge. Elias, still at the bottom with Finch, screamed encouragement. Marty, summoning a deep reserve of strength, lunged for the rope, catching it with her free hand. Silas pulled and she was dragged up, shaking but safe, into the passage above. Elias was next. The ascent with Finch's dead weight on his back was a Herculean effort. Every muscle screamed in protest. Halfway up, the third rung from the bottom, where Silas had tested the weight and moved on, gave way. Elias felt the wood splinter and fell 3 feet, his fall cushioned only by the quick tensioning of the rope Silas held above. He scraped his shin violently against the rock, the pain a searing clean focus in the haze of exhaustion. He gritted his teeth, found a foothold on a lower bolt, and continued to climb, fueled by an almost insane refusal to fail. When he finally emerged at the top, Silas and Marty helped pull him, collapsing onto a solid, dry stone floor. They were in a smaller, higher cavern. "We made it," Marty whispered, tears of relief and exhaustion streaming down her face. Elias lay there gasping, looking at Dr. Finch. The doctor's face was ashen, his breathing barely noticeable. As they rested, Silas pointed his lamp into a dark corner. On the wall, carved crudely into the limestone, was a chilling message, left recently. "I warned you, Finch. The deep shaft is mine. Enjoy your tomb. H." The inscription confirmed their deepest fear. Hollister was here ahead of them, using the maze as his weapon. But it also offered a clue. If the deep shaft was his goal, he was heading deeper, not out. The group stood up, their resolve renewed by the tangible evidence of their enemy. They had survived his barricade and his psychological warfare. As they moved toward the next passage, Marty stopped. She looked back at the air chimney, then at the inscription, then at Elias. "Elias," she said, her voice shaking with a new kind of dread. "If this chimney leads up to the surface, and Hollister used it, why did he go down into the deep shaft after carving this warning? Why wouldn't he escape?" The terrifying answer was immediate and clear to Elias. Hollister wasn't just after the deep shaft. He was down there for something else, something he was trying to hide. The mystery of the true purpose of Hollister's actions was about to unfold. The passage from the air chimney led them into a strange, unnerving tunnel. The walls were unnaturally smooth, and the path was level, as if it had been excavated by hand, not by water. The air was stale, the draft having vanished, replaced by an oppressive stillness. The sweet metallic odor from the barricade site was now faint, but undeniably present, woven into the heavy air. They moved slowly, Elias's injured leg making him rely heavily on Marty's support. Dr. Finch's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His breathing was almost imperceptible. "We have to find the surface soon, Elias," Marty urged, her voice tight with worry. "He can't last much longer. None of us can." Silas, leading the way, suddenly stopped, raising his hand. "Hold. I hear something." It wasn't the sound of falling rock or running water. It was a rhythmic, faint clanking, the sound of metal on metal coming from a chamber just ahead. They extinguished their lamps and crept forward, their hearts pounding in the absolute darkness. Peering around the corner, they saw a chilling, isolated scene. The passage opened into a medium-sized chamber, perfectly circular, illuminated by a single weak, flickering electric lamp. Their own brand, left behind. In the center, stooped over a pile of loose rock, was a solitary, gaunt figure, his clothes covered in a fine layer of dust. Dr. Arthur Hollister. He was not charting or collecting samples. He was working with a small, hand-powered crank and a series of metal chains, pulling up a heavy, long object from a narrow, natural well in the floor. The clanking they heard was the chain grinding against the lip of the well. Hollister was clearly exhausted. his movements jerky and desperate. He was not looking for a scientific breakthrough. He was trying to retrieve something he had hidden. Elias, Marty, and Silas watched in stunned silence as the object finally emerged from the well. It was a metal military-style ammunition crate, heavily rusted and secured with a thick padlock. Marty gasped, covering her mouth to suppress the sound. "He's not a rival geologist, Elias. He's a thief. What did he hide down here?" Elias's mind reeled. The stolen research, the sudden disappearance, the obsessive focus on this specific part of the cave. It all clicked into place. Hollister wasn't after a geological discovery. He was hiding something illegal, something that required the deep, untraceable nature of the cave. Silas, his eyes narrowed, pointed to the tools scattered around Hollister. "Look at the cans. They're empty. That's where the sweetness came from. He used nitrobenzene, diluted with oil. It's a chemical used in mining to slowly weaken rock formations. He used it to clear the path ahead for his own retrieval, not to seal us in. The collapse was his insurance." Hollister, hearing a faint scrape from Elias's boot, froze. He slowly turned, his eyes wide and manic, illuminated by the single flickering lamp. He looked less like a respected scientist and more like a desperate, wild creature. "Finch," Hollister whispered, his voice hoarse, seeing Elias's general outline in the darkness. "You followed me. You wouldn't leave it alone. I told you. I buried my mistake here." Elias stepped forward, Marty and Silas covering his flanks. "It's not Finch, Hollister. He's barely alive. You killed 10 men with your ambition. What is in that box?" Hollister let out a chilling, high-pitched laugh that echoed off the circular walls. 10 men? It was worth it. It's all here. The evidence. The bonds. The whole town's fortune that they claimed Finch and I stole. He framed me, you see. But I hid the real cash, right here, where no one would look. The full, horrifying truth was laid bare. The entire expedition was a disastrous consequence of a decades-old buried crime. Finch and Hollister, partners in an elaborate bank fraud, had hidden a massive cache of stolen bonds deep in the cave. Finch, feeling guilty and facing death, had subtly led Elias to the area, hoping to expose Hollister and clear his own name posthumously. Hollister raised a small, glinting object in his hand. It was a heavy metal file, sharp and deadly. "You won't take it. You won't leave this cave. I'll seal you all in just like I did the bonds." He moved toward the well, intending to shove the crate back down. Silas, without a word, lunged. The two men collided with a sickening thud, sending the electric lamp skittering across the floor and plunging the chamber back into absolute darkness. The fight was brutal and primal. The sounds of grunts, scuffling, and the metallic ring of Silas's hammer against the file filled the chamber. Elias and Marty, unable to see, could only hear the deadly struggle. Then, a sudden, horrifying sound. A heavy, dull thud, followed by a splash from the well. Then silence. The chains rattled, but the fight had ended. Elias screamed, "Silas! Marty! What happened?" Marty's shaking voice answered from the blackness just inches away. "The well." Silas pushed him. "But the crate is gone too. It fell down." The sound of the splash meant the well was deep, likely connected to the subterranean river. Hollister and his stolen treasure were gone, swallowed by the earth. But were they truly safe? Elias felt a profound, uneasy sense of victory. The villain was defeated, but the mystery of the cave was now stained with blood and avarice. The silence that followed the splash was heavier than any rockfall, thick with the finality of Hollister's demise. Elias, Marty, and Silas slowly turned their lamps back on, revealing the desolate chamber. Silas was bruised and breathing hard, his face streaked with sweat and exhaustion, but otherwise unharmed. The ammunition crate, the source of all the terror and death, was gone. "He's gone," Silas stated, his voice flat. "The well is deep. It leads to the river grotto." Marty went to check on Dr. Finch, who had miraculously remained stable throughout the chaos. She gently felt his wrist for a pulse. It was faint, but still there. "He needs help now, Elias." We're running out of time. Hollister's route is too dangerous, and the collapse sealed the main path. Silas, what's the engineer's instinct telling you about this chamber? Elias looked around the circular room. The smooth walls, the well, the stale air, it all pointed to a specific geological anomaly. This isn't a natural cave. It's a dome pit, a chamber formed by centuries of water erosion dropping down a sinkhole. It should have a narrow vertical path leading straight up, perhaps to a high-level opening. Silas, nodding, began to search the high ceiling with his lamp beam. He found it, a small, almost undetectable circular vent nearly 60 feet above them. The air chimney gave us the draft, Silas explained. This pit gave Hollister access to the river to hide his stash, and it can give us a path out. We can't climb the smooth walls. We have to use the ropes and the well equipment. It was a daunting task. They had to jury-rig a pulley system using the remnants of the chain and crank Hollister had used, securing it to the strongest rock outcropping they could find, and then attempt an unassisted rope climb. The final ascent was a slow, grueling test of their last reserves of strength and will. Silas, the least injured and most experienced, went first, securing the line. Marty, fueled by a ferocious will to live and document the truth, followed. Elias, with Finch strapped to his back, used every ounce of his engineering knowledge to leverage his weight and inch upward. The climb took over 3 hours. Elias's injured leg felt like lead. His arms were screaming, and the weight of Dr. Finch felt monumental. The silence was the worst, the only sound the rasping of rope on rock and their own ragged breathing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elias felt Marty's hands on his collar, pulling him over the lip of the vent. He collapsed onto the floor, pulling Dr. Finch to safety beside him. They were in a low, tight tunnel. The air was fresh and cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, the smell of the surface. Tears of relief streamed down Elias's face, mingling with the grime and sweat. They crawled for what felt like miles, pulling Finch behind them. The tunnel ended in a low opening, partially hidden by a thicket of brush and roots. They pushed the roots aside and blinked in the sudden glorious brightness of the mid-morning sun. They were out. Elias, Marty, and Silas sat on the damp earth outside the hidden vent, gulping the fresh air, their bodies broken, their minds scarred. Dr. Finch was still barely alive, his shallow breaths visible in the cool morning air. It took another hour for Elias to regain enough strength to stagger down the wooded slope and find the nearest logging road, where he collapsed in front of a startled wagon driver. The rescue operation was swift and massive. Dr. Finch was rushed to the nearest hospital, clinging to life. Elias, Marty, and Silas, though physically injured, were medically cleared, but the truth they carried was a heavier burden. Days later, Dr. Alistair Finch died in the hospital, his final confession that he and Hollister had conspired to steal the bonds, and that he had used the expedition to expose his partner, given to Marty and Elias, clearing his conscience before his death. The official report would detail the Mammoth Cave disaster as a catastrophic geological collapse that claimed the lives of 17 explorers. Elias, Marty, and Silas would be the only 3 accounted for, the sole survivors of the initial 12 who escaped the first trap. The remaining men were never found, their bodies sealed deep within the earth. Elias Vance, his ambition now tempered by an agonizing understanding of human frailty and malice, never charted another cave. He used his remaining funds to finance the necessary seals and stabilization efforts for the dangerous area. Martha Hayes wrote her story, a terrifying, meticulously detailed account of the expedition, the human failures, the calculated sabotage, and the slow psychological descent into terror. Her final article mentioned the 17 explorers who entered, the 10 who died in the collapse or by the cruel choices of self-preservation, and the one, Hollister, who vanished along with his terrible secret. But the final line of her account, and the unspoken truth that haunted Elias Vance and Silas Thorne for the rest of their lives, was this: 17 men entered the cave that day in 1903. 10 were killed by the disaster and the fear it unleashed. 5 were lost to their own selfish panic. 1 was a murderer and a thief swallowed by the earth. 1 died carrying his conscience. And only 1, Elias Vance, the proud, ambitious engineer, emerged alive and truly whole, carrying the weight of the single fatal mistake that had cost them all.